The following is a conversation with Troy Hunt, renowned independent cybersecurity researcher who transformed his passion into a globally trusted resource. Troy is the founder of Have I Been Pwned, a service used by millions to check if their data has been compromised in breaches. With over 20 years in tech, Troy shared his insights on the evolving landscape of data breaches, phishing as a service, and practical advice for mitigating these cyber risks. Thank you, Troy, for your time. Subscribe to the Bytes podcast for more conversations like this.
But maybe you'll surprise me later. No pressure now.
I would love to be able to surprise you. I think, we are generally, I guess, trying to approach this from a place of, we've both been in the industry for a couple of years now. And what we've found is that it's so broad, and every kind of different part that we find out about, we're more and more curious about. Data breaches is obviously a prevalent part across the entire sort of gamut of cyber. But I suppose the individual impacts is kind of where we're most interested in speaking to you about, because you have a lot of expertise in dealing with, I guess, the individuals and their kind of information that's found. I find that aspect really fascinating because Beck and I tend to work with organizations and the staff within those organizations and that kind of side of cyber. So I find that personal side and how that ties into the overall work protection, human firewall aspect, like fascinating. So that's kind of where a lot of the questions will come from, if that makes sense.
Sweet. Yeah, look, I think the human sort of social side of things is really interesting. And you tend to get people that are very, very focused on the bits and the bytes, and they miss that whole bit, and then they wonder why stuff doesn't work. It's like, well, it's just like when people go, how on earth are we still using passwords? Passwords are terrible. So, well, everyone knows how to use them. What do you got? Oh, you have U2F keys. Yeah, I'll try getting that to my mum. See how that goes.
100%. What are your thoughts on pass keys and the evolution of that?
I think technically really good. I feel there's a bit of a marketing problem. Yeah. Again, how do I explain that to both my parents? They're well into their 70s. They're not digital natives. Geez, I mean, I didn't get on the internet till I was 18. You look at the kids now, and they just grow up, and everything is around them that's connected, and they understand it from day one. For my parents, who went through really until pretty much retirement before they had internet the way we know it today, it's a hard grasp for them. And I think where we struggle a little bit with the marketing pitch is it's not clear that it's not a password. It's not something that you recall. But then there's a question of synchronization. Is it device bound, or is it bound to your account somewhere and you sync it via your password? To be honest, even I sit here and go, hang on a moment, how did I do that?
Which one isn't connected to that is the same device? Yeah, 100%. I also think, it kind of relies a little bit on the existing infrastructure, where I've seen text messages taking you to a link which connects to your wallet, like using Passkit and things like that, where we're still kind of trying to merge the two ways of communicating, and they're kind of incongruent with one another in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I just did a few passkeys for like the work computer and my phone and things like that, and none of them are working. And I know that if I sit down and actually pay attention to how they work, I can probably do it. But at the moment, I'm just like, until I can explain this to someone else, I don't think I should be, trying a new piece of technology right now.
And everyone does it differently too, right? Like every entity does it differently. I do a weekly ABC radio piece here on the Gold Coast, which is very consumer focused. And yesterday morning, the host was we got around to passkeys and things like that, and different means of authentication, because we were looking at one of the NCA takedowns the other day of a one-time password phishing kit. And the video was showing just how simple it is to phish a one-time password. And she was sort of saying, but, you can go and turn on like security keys on your bank, right? And it's like, well, it depends if the bank supports it or not. Well, if they do, how do you do it? Well, it depends, because they all do it differently. And when you try and explain that to normal everyday people, which of course is the vast majority of people using these systems, you just sort of realize, wow, it's a kludgy mess, isn't it?
Is there like one cybersecurity technique or thing of policy off the top of your head, like silver bullet, that you think if everyone could just do that with the snap of your fingers, what would that be? Is
password
MFA,
manager?
passkeys?
Password manager. Well, it's you think about the risks that most individuals face and what's hitting them the most, and it's account takeovers and fraudulent activity. Money taken from banks because they've approved one-time passwords and things like that. Yeah, password managers is one of those things that just takes out so much of that low hanging fruit. It's ridiculous. It's not going to solve all the problems, and we've still got the usability problem, right? I mean,
I was about to
explaining to the
say,
average
it's also about
person.
using it correctly, because if you use a password manager but they're all the same password, I mean, it's just basically an advanced autofill for the same password.
It is, although when you put it that way, it's not without benefit, is it? Because it won't autofill your password into a phishing site. It'll have to find the site that's bound to the correct domain.
True.
So even then, if you use a password manager badly, you're probably better off than not using one at all, right?
Great point. So password management is kind of top of it, and I guess that makes sense, being your expertise in data breaches. The rise of access brokerage probably adds like a whole nother level to all of this, because there's people going and getting things, and then there's people actually using that to infiltrate organizations or people or whatever have you. So, yeah, do you have any thoughts on, I guess, how this trend in particular has influenced the rise in these data breaches?
Well, it's a little bit like the topic that kicked off this discussion on the radio yesterday, which was around this one-time password phishing as a service. So, the guys who got arrested, they weren't necessarily the primary party phishing the OTPs off the victims. They built the service, and then other people came around and used the service. And I was explaining to the host, it's like this, it's like Jim's Mowing for phishing. Like this is a business.
It's a franchise.
Model.
It's a business.
Exactly. And we see the same thing, obviously, with ransomware crews and affiliates. And we all heard a lot about that in Australia a couple of years ago with Medibank. And I think everyone sort of got to grips with the fact that this is a big business. So, when we look at it through that lens and the fact that this is working in a way that scales beyond what just the individuals who create this service can do, you sort of get to a sense of how broad it is, right?
When I talk to some of my friends and family and explain to them that these cyber gangs are businesses and they can run almost identically to a legitimate business with, excuse me, their own websites and procedures and things like that. And as you said, the as a service sort of tagline for software as a service, it's just such a huge enterprise, and there's a reason why it's still going. I mean, they are making money; people are still falling for it. So
they pay a lot less tax than us, but other than that, it's like a business, isn't it?
How big a part do those like compilations of credentials that are found, like data breach compilations, do they play a very big part in that access brokerage part of the sphere, if you will? Particularly like things like RockU, and like the new RockU 2024 just came out. Is that like a massive contributor to the number of data breaches as well?
That's a massive pain in the backside every time I hear it, to be honest. Because there was like a RockU 2022 or something as well, and I think for people listening to this and not quite sure that the history of that, RockU was a service that was breached. It must have been about 13 years ago now. It was a long time ago. It became canonical because all the passwords in plain text had millions and millions of them, and we had this corpus of real-world passwords in plain text that could then be used for account takeover attacks, creating targeted rainbow tables or credential stuffing, whatever it may be, and that's what it was. And then we've gotten to this point where people seem to be using that name to then apply it to other corpuses of not even passwords, but let's call them strings. So the one that popped out a couple of years ago, which was about 8 billion, a lot of that was comprised from written works, and they just went and took all the words out of it and added it to them. So when this one came out earlier this year, and now it's 10 billion, and all these headlines, the new RockU 2024, 10 billion, and everyone's losing their minds. It's like it's largely junk.
It is largely junk. I mean, I'm on that compilation, and it's a password I haven't used in 12 years or so. So, but I take your point. A lot of it is just junk information, right?
But then like the other 90% of it wasn't a password that anybody ever used. And I got to the point where I was like, I'm going to buy a big hard disk, and I'm going to copy paste the whole thing. I'm going to add one to the end of every password, and I'm going to have the biggest RockU list out of everybody. So there.
So it's rather inconsequential, I guess, is what you're trying to get at, the size of the breach. It's more about the relevance of the targets and potentially the timeliness of the data that's collected, and less around like, oh, well, I have a giant 12 gig text file.
I think the bigger observation here is filtering down the headlines to the real world impact. And what's actually behind it. It's like the number of times we say, oh, it's dark web data on dark web data. No, it's literally on the clear web. It's on www.clearweb.com. popularhackerforum.com, and you go there with Chrome, and it's by every single definition the clear web. It's nowhere near as sort of scary and secreted away in the corners. That's Telegram. That's a different story.
Absolutely, and one that we could potentially get into if you wanted to, but
yeah, why not?
So I guess when it comes down to the unique challenges presented by some of these things, I mean, it's mostly down to, it seems like human error, but I mean, what part can technical mitigations play? I mean, things like adaptive authentication or password similarity checks or anything like, is that stuff really necessary if people are educated enough?
I think first of all, you often hear journalists will ask the question, or you'll see it in the press or something, and it'll be like, what percentage of data breaches are due to human error? And all these headlines, 94% of data breaches are due to human error. Can you ever think of a data, like, has there ever been a data breach where everything went right? And you go, I don't know what happened. Like, we did everything right. Nobody made any mistakes whatsoever. And there's always a mistake somewhere, 100% a human error. And the question then just becomes, how reasonable was that error? Well, there was some like super sophisticated attack that we didn't think about, or someone joined a whole bunch of dots. It wasn't like Optus and we just changed the number at the end of a URL. There's a spectrum here. I think then in terms of the role humans have to play there, we do make mistakes, and we are vulnerable. We as developers make mistakes. It's so easy to misconfigure something, the smallest sort of misconfiguration these days. And very often there is a single point of failure, or it's enough to get a foothold and find other problems in other places. And I like that saying of we as defenders have to get it right every single time, and the attackers only have to get it right once. And that's often what it feels like. There's so many different places that we've got to get things spot on. And every time I push code now, I'm like, geez, there's this bit and that bit and that bit and that bit. Something goes wrong. Here we are.
There's a lot of pressure that cybersecurity professionals put themselves under to get it right every single time. I mean, in your sort of experience, how do you sort of disconnect from that at the end of the day? I mean, you say, you're pushing code out and going, oh my God, is this going to be okay? But how do you kind of just let it be?
Eventually got to the point about 2 hours ago with Stefan, our Icelandic code implementer, who we had broken something that we couldn't fix, and we're like, go to bed, mate. It's like it's midnight. I can see the mistakes you're making now because you're human just like the rest of us.
It's a tomorrow problem.
Yeah, it's an absolute tomorrow problem. I was like, look, we'll just roll back to the last good version. It was only a staging environment anyway, so it's like it's fine. Go to bed, sleep it off. I think maybe the nature of our role, and probably because there's a lot of people in this industry that genuinely love what they do and they're passionate about it as well, it can be very hard to turn off. And I was having the discussion with my wife just today where it's like, look, there's just always something. Like, when do you just go, all right, I'm just going to like put it down and step away? And it's particularly hard if you're independent and you can do whatever else you want, because if you like what you do, it just kind of never stops. I don't have a good answer for that, but let me know if you figure it out.
Will do. I'll write a book.
Yeah, no, you'd make money out of it, sure.
Well,
I wanted to talk about, I was about to say, I'd like to talk about your book and your website. Have I been pwned, or is it pawned? I've never been truly clear on the actual pronunciation of that word.
It's funny. I mean, it's a strange name for what's become a popular service, but I built it at a time where I didn't expect it to be popular. Otherwise, I wouldn't have given it such a stupid name. But it's hard to get a domain name, right? Even in 2013, it's hard to get a .com domain name. So I came up with that. And funnily enough, now it's become popular, and occasionally people say, look, will you give it a serious name? Like, now it's become popular. Isn't it time you grow up?
It's too late.
No, it's a conversation starter.
Stick to your roots, mate. That's what brought it about. That's what made everyone love it. I feel like, there's something to that resonated with everyone,
I wonder if there's a bit of Aussie larrikin in it as well, unintentionally at the time. But I got to go to Washington, D.C. and sit in Congress and get congressmen and congresswomen to say pwned. That's my claim.
It's unbelievable.
Beautiful.
My mum is by no means a tech head, but when I said I'm going to be speaking to Troy Hunt, she was like, oh yeah, who's that? And I said, have I been pwned? And she knew exactly who I was referring to. It also got her to say the word pwned. So
that's amazing.
To you that
but hey, because of the pronunciations, I do have all of these different domains. I've got the obvious, have I been pawned? That redirects straight to my website. Thank you.
Right.
Have I been prawned? I have as well. That was one that popped up somewhere in the American press one day, and I thought, that's actually pretty good. I'll take that. Who knows? I might use that one day.
Yeah, I guess with the accent. So how severe is the risk to an individual if they type in their email address and they find out that they have in fact been pwned? What is the big deal there?
I think it's in a way it's sort of an obvious question, but I think there's a deeper observation here in terms of really being able to understand what the actual risk of being in a data breach poses to you. Maybe to start with me, I'm in Have I Been Pwned about 36 times for various things I signed up on because I've been on the internet for 30 years and I've bought stuff and gone places and I've got this long tail, but it's obvious stuff like LinkedIn and Dropbox. And then it's all the edge stuff that I'd never even thought about. I was in the House data breach, which apparently was something to do with interior design. And I don't know how I got in there, but I know the IP address, which was a London IP address, lined up with my TripIt when I was in London. And it's got my email address, so it's probably me. I mean, all of these weird things. And I guess the first thing is that you really can't stop yourself from being in a data breach. And not going online isn't a fix either. I was in the Australian Red Cross Blood Service data breach because I went into the blood van and with a pencil and paper, wrote all my details on and handed it over and did my good deed. And a couple of years later, here I am in the data breach. So you just literally cannot stop yourself from being in a breach. So I think really the question is more about how do you mitigate the risk or the impact rather when you are. And we've spoken about password managers. That's the obvious one. If you're not reusing your passwords, people aren't going to be taking over your accounts in other places. Where possible, minimizing the information that you provide, but it's such a caveated suggestion because so often you don't have a choice, like you go to sign up to somewhere and it wants your date of birth. It's like, why do you want my date of birth? There's a funny one. When I ask this online, I'll go, I've just had such and such a data breach. It's like a cat forum or something like that. And people go, why, I'll say, why did you, ask for your date of birth? Cat forum. That's stupid. And time again, people say, you need to ask for your date of birth because of COPPA, the Child Online Privacy Protection Act, because you've got to be 13. And then I'll say, well, why don't you just ask, are you 13? And if you're 13, you get in. If you're not, you don't. And I kid you not, the number of times people say you can't do that because people could lie.
Oh, no.
It's like, every single site I can think of in Australia that I've gone to that's like a brewery or something like that. There's a big prompt site. Are you 18? Yep.
Yes.
Okay, go.
In you go. Yeah.
And you still don't get to taste the beer because it's a website. But then again, there's lots of other classes of online service where the delivery is purely digital and you have to, if you lie about your age, you get things you probably shouldn't be getting. So anyway, the point is that you get challenged for things that are probably not rightly sensitive pieces of data. I think date of birth should be sensitive insofar as some people might not want others to know how old they are. Remember back in the day, it's like your mum would go, I don't want to tell people my age because I'm feeling old. Okay, I understand that. But we've created an environment where your date of birth is a piece of static knowledge-based authentication. It's actually part of proving your identity now. And still to this day, the number of times major telcos, for example, are saying, look, you call up, you want to do something with your phone plan, and they're like, okay, we just need to make sure you are who you say you are. What's your date of birth?
Oh, man. I hate it when they call you and then they ask you, and you're like, mate, you just called me on my registered number to ask me a question and you want me to run through all of my personally identifiable information. I'm like, I'll call you back.
Yeah, and then how do you know it's them? Because very often they're like, let me give you the number to call. No, I know what you're doing there. I'm going to do that. So I think that the requests for data are part of a problem. And there's always the option of lying, right? And a lot of people say, well, you should just lie on all the responses. Your problem then is you got to remember which lies you've told to whom. Because later on, when they use that as part of your identity verification process, I got to remember whether it was my real birthday or the 1st of January 2000. It's a big skew to the 1st of January every time I see a data breach dates of birth. And then you got to figure out which ones you shouldn't lie to at all, because some of them might be a government entity. Some of them might later on check your registration with your driver's license when you want to get into the venue or something like that. Now, maybe things like having a digital identity like the Aussie government seem to be going down the road with, maybe that will help in some cases, except most of the data breaches are in other countries. So that won't really solve that problem.
The digital ID kind of aspect puts the onus of responsibility on that consumer, that user of the providing the information, when really kind of what you're alluding to, I believe, if I may put words in your mouth, is that the actual the process of collecting that data from the get-go is the kind of wrong way to look at it. So is that a correct way to potentially approach it, is by the institutional approach being we don't need that, so we're not going to get it, as opposed to give it to us and we'll figure out later if we need to hold on to it?
Yeah, very much. And of course, the use cases and the regulatory obligation differs organisation by organisation. But if we take Optus, because it was such a big thing in Australia, that led to people queuing up around main roads offices and things like this in order to get new driver's licenses. It's kind of crazy where you've got, first of all, the requirement to capture that. Send us what in many cases is a photocopy or a digitized version of your identity, as if you can't fake that. And we will use that to prove who you are. We have to prove who you are because we've got regulations in case you do terrorism things on the telephone, and we need to be able to tie it back to you. I mean, that just seems like a very odd kind of necessity, given all the different ways you can do the nasty things online. And then we'll retain it, even if you leave as a customer for a long time, which of course is one of the other things there.
Mm-hmm.
And that the reason it became such an issue when that data got disclosed is because we do identity verification with some numbers. Now, if you're listening this from America, you have social security numbers, and all of them just got leaked as well. So, it's kind of crazy that we're in a world where we're kind of wandering around like cryptographic devices in our hands, on our wrists, and all these are sort of amazing technological proofs that we can provide that we're reciting numbers.
Yeah, 100%.
And we can change our driver's licenses too. It's almost impossible in the US to change a social security number. So,
I mean, the social security number aspect is almost like that health data. It doesn't change. So once that does get kind of leaked or compromised, you're kind of out of luck with, the correction of it, or hoping that it isn't correct because it's your medicine, your medical history doesn't change.
I think if we look at it through the lens of why do we have this, you just got to keep scrolling back to a point where it made sense. And it was a point before we had data breaches like this and we had all the systems digitized. And it was a good enough at the time sort of model, but it just feels like everything has moved forward so quickly and all our old identity verification methods have come with us and we're getting a few other things with them, but the old ones just aren't dying yet.
Mm-hmm.
I read a really cool, well, not cool, but interesting story about the American Social Security number issues. And one person on Reddit said, hey, I just did a credit check and somebody's used my Social Security number to get a bank loan to buy a house. And they've bought a house, but they're making the repayments. This person is actually diligently maintaining this identity. So, of course, what's happened is some poor illegal immigrant has purchased this identity package and just set up a life, and they're actually just living their life perfectly. And this person is like, what do I do?
I take the house. Definitely take the house.
Overwhelmingly, every comment was sell the house, sell the house, sell the house. And I was like, oh, what an interesting situation in cybercrime. I mean, usually you think someone's going to steal that information to identity theft you and, steal a lot of money or do some really nefarious things. But this was just some poor guy raising his family and being a good citizen, but not a citizen.
Not a citizen, might have been bankrupt in the past. It is interesting the motivations that drive people to commit identity fraud. It's clearly a broad spectrum. In speaking to you, Troy, I find that you're quite transparent. It appears in what not only you think, but the way in which you kind of approach these things. I wonder, as the creator of Have I Been Pwned, you've managed to build a really impressive reputation within the industry, particularly as someone that's not affiliated with a traditional organization. It's just kind of been you and I believe your partner and now Stefan.
Yeah.
What do you believe were the key factors to kind of rising above the tide of all these things and kind of becoming such a revered expert?
Luck. That was part of it, but there's also that old saying about the harder you work, the luckier you get too. I mean, there's just been extraordinary amounts of work that are going into this, which a lot of people see a lot of, and there's a lot of other stuff as well. But that's I have been fortunate there with the luck of the timing. I mean, part of the reason I started getting so involved in InfoSec and writing blogs is I started hating my job. I spent 14 years working for Pfizer, and at one point in time, they said if you're a good software developer, if you want your career to progress, you've got to stop doing that. But I like building software. Well, do you like pay rises? Yeah. Okay, stop. So you got to go and do something else. And I became an architect, which I loathed because it basically just meant dealing with other people's crappy code. Because we're outsourcing everything out to very cheap markets around the world, and I'd spend a lot of my time just trawling through other people's code and then going back, going, this is wrong, that's wrong. Let's not expose all our customers' clinical trial data to everybody, and whatever it may be.
Oh,
but
gosh.
that was the thing that drove me to start writing the blog post. So I was fortunate with the timing. And then I was fortunate that they made me redundant at a point when my independent life was really taking off, and they gave me enough runway because I'd been there for so long and I had other income and other opportunities. So that was good, and it was something that I enjoy as well.
Amazing.
I've really just genuinely enjoy it. I find it fascinating every time someone sends a data breach and I'm like, oh, wow, what's this? Where did it come from? Is it real? I just think that's a really interesting thing. And what I think is particularly fascinating is I was probably very career focused and very financially minded up until, 10 years ago or something when I started doing this. And then I got really focused on all this other stuff and sort of didn't really think about the other things. And everything just happened then because suddenly I built something that people find really useful.
Very useful, yeah.
And created a reputation. There's demand for speaking and workshops and training and everything else. And all of that just kind of snowballed. And I just think a huge amount of that success has been good fortune with the timing. And to your point about the transparency, because there was never a financial motive, it's like, look, I'm just going to put it out there. Everyone go, use it. I could explain it exactly as it is. There wasn't anything to sort of cover up or hide or ulterior motives or things like that.
I think that's the most interesting thing to me is it's almost like a public service, but it's been brought about by an individual entirely. Like there's no kind of, you didn't get seed funding, you didn't get like, the ACSC is like a thing to then push it out. It's just been you doing the thing. And I love that. I mean, what could you give any advice to other aspiring cybersecurity or InfoSec professionals or independent researchers that like also feel similarly, maybe stuck, but also want to contribute to this, but don't know if like they're trusted enough or capable enough or anything of that nature?
Yeah. How do you establish yourself as a trusted voice, I guess?
Well, I guess first of all, we all start out untrusted and incapable, and then we work up from there, right? So every single one of us started. I think in the tech industry in general, not just cybersecurity, the first blog post I ever wrote, which was a few weeks before my son was born, and he's about to turn 15. So I've been blogging for about 15 years. And the first one I wrote was about why online identities are smart career moves. And at the time, I was working at Pfizer, interviewing people for developer roles, and someone would send their CV in and they want to be a .NET developer, and the CV would come in and they were all awesome. They all looked fantastic. And okay, well, how do I know you're fantastic? Do you have like are you contributing to Stack Overflow? Are you doing talks? Are you involved in communities? Is there any sort of independent verification for me as someone who's possibly going to hire you to establish your credentials? And they'd go, well, I've got references, but you chose them. You're only going to choose good people. So you're going to get your mates to talk to me, to tell me how good, like it doesn't make any sense. And the point I was making with that first blog post, and I didn't have that online identity at the time, was that I think that there is value in putting stuff out there for other people to see in terms of forwarding your career. And that's really the answer now. There are so many different things you can do, more so now than ever before, where you can put out code there in so many different open source repositories you can contribute to. You can start your own. You can get involved in so many different sub-communities within tech. I mean, I find myself now doing the developer stuff, the InfoSec stuff, the 3D printing stuff, and the home automation stuff. And there's all these different communities and a heap more.
Which one today or now? Like,
what's on my desk today? No 3D. I haven't started the 3D printer for a few days. The home automation stuff is always on the back of the mind because something's always broken. But, look, every day there's some degree of writing code and looking at data breaches. So those two are always there. And the others, like, weirdly enough, are my mental break from doing the first two. Just this morning, I was like, I should find something to print just so that every time I walk past it, I got something cool to look at and it takes my mind off the work for a bit.
I love that. I mean, having something that you're clearly someone that likes to put yourself into different things. So I love to see that as well. I think it's definitely something with a lot of different
my wife was lamenting this morning because she was like, it's so hard to keep up with this pace. It's like there's always, and I say this on a day where she's out there playing tennis all day and I'm sitting here working. So I don't think that's entirely fair, but anyway.
I definitely find that in the industry as well. Like, definitely a lot of people have quite niche interests, but they all are kind of very related in a lot of ways. Like the home automation and the developer and the 3D printing, I imagine they all kind of feed off each other a little bit.
Well, those things, yes, in the tech space, but then the things I like to do that are more leisure are usually the opposite of that. And as my wife says, I keep choosing things that I have to pay attention to, otherwise they'll really hurt or kill me. I was really involved in motorsport for a long time because I had to pay attention to that, and I'm just getting back into that now. My son's getting old enough to drive. I've really like going wakeboarding or getting out on the jet ski and just opening it up, or things that are fast and require focus, because I find that just blocks out all the other things that will creep into my mind if I don't do that. I play a lot of tennis too, and I enjoy it. But if I play for more than a couple of hours, the thoughts start getting into my mind, and I lose my focus.
Do you find those physical adrenaline associated activities kind of are important to be able to maintain that momentum across such a? It goes up and down in cyber as well. Like some days nothing happens, and some days weeks happen, at a time. So
yeah, and I'm always kind of the view that I need to be far enough ahead that when something like that happens, I can put everything else down and drop that. If I feel like I'm constantly behind, and I've got an inbox full of stuff I've got to deal with, and then something big happens, that's when I do feel the stress. And I certainly have times where that stress and anxiety really builds up, and it's definitely not good.
I'm away from
so you've got you were saying your son is about to be old enough to drive. How early did you start him on his cybersecurity journey?
So he's 14. He can drive on a racetrack. He just can't drive on the road. So I put him on a racetrack last weekend for the first time, and we'll start doing that every few weeks. So by the time he actually gets on the road with all the crazies going different directions and
he'll be a pro.
e-scooters and crap like that, he would have learned on a racetrack where it's a bit safer. But for the cybersecurity stuff, for both the kids, our daughters just turned 12. They all get a lot of exposure to it implicitly. Things like password managers. They have had password managers for many, many, many years, and they never think twice about having strong, unique passwords everywhere with Authenticator app built into the password manager. Like, it's just a given. But they grow up and they get that reinforced. Our kids have had a bit of extra opportunity because of what I do, where I've had my son teaching other kids to code at conferences around the world since he was about 11 was the first time.
Wow.
We just took our daughter to Norway in June to do a presentation to adults with me on 3D printing. So
amazing.
That is very cool.
They get that access, and we've got a bit of an unfair advantage there. But I think everyone that lives in this industry has got this massive opportunity where they have access to technology, which will be all of the jobs of the future. We're very sort of digital workers, where they can share these things with their kids for next to no money as well. I mean, they've both been learning to code originally on things like code.org or Scratch or Code Combat or all of these things where they're literally free websites. You don't have to go and buy stuff, just like sit them at the computer and get them doing that. And I just think it's fascinating seeing kids embrace that stuff like a decade earlier than what I got the opportunity to do. So yeah, who knows what they'll do one day.
I also
go
for it back.
Oh, thanks. If you could say design a cyber hygiene curriculum even for children starting at maybe even kindergarten, because kids are sort of born with a device in their hands these days. What do you think the first key lessons should be?
I think the first thing I'd want to do actually is start with the parents, because the parents have got the worst habits. But I'll give you an example of why I say that. I was speaking to some. In fact, I remember who it was. I was helping. I won't name her. I was helping one of my son's friends' parents the other day, and she's a doctor. And what it boiled down to is that the son was logging on to her laptop using her credentials in order to do all his school stuff. Now, I'm not sure if there was any crossover between the stuff that she does at the surgery and the stuff that she does at home, but when I heard that, I thought, did you know they can have their own account? Or people in an iOS world where they've got kids with no parental controls, have got access to all of the apps, they've got no visibility into things like screen time, for example, let alone the ability to do things like share the apps that you purchase or watch the movies that one person has purchased and the other one. Simple things like parental controls. Which are built in natively. You don't have to go and spend money to go and buy some seedy system that backs up all their photos to a cloud somewhere. You know, there's all this stuff built in. I'd love to start with parents. And I've often thought we should just try and line up like parent workshops and go, look, just come on down, we'll set up the basics and, you know, get you on the right track. But I think it's a little bit hard when kids don't have that compass to follow. And I don't know that the teachers are a whole lot better either most of the time. And they have to try and figure it out themselves. And, you know, we see what happens when kids try and work stuff out themselves a lot of the time too.
I think a big part of it for parents a lot of the time is also understanding that kind of what's in it for me. Because I often hear people say like, okay, I know MFA, I should have MFA, but it's like a whole other thing. I got to do this thing every time. It's like, why? No one's going to hack me. And it's like, yeah, until it happens. And that level of security is that peace of mind for every one of your accounts and your identity. So it's about, I guess, understanding what you're sacrificing for what you're gaining. And if that understanding is there, then they can pass that on to their children and their younger cohorts.
I think you're right in that people don't see the value until it impacts them in some way. And it's a little bit like a lot of organizations, I think, don't see the value until it impacts them. But in my experience, the number of times I've had an organization that hasn't been that interested, and then a data breach or something happens, and they will throw any amount of money possible to make the problem go away, which of course it can't go away by that time. You can only mitigate it. But they've needed to wait until it really bites them. I mean, even for us in Australia, there's such a different focus now after Optus and Medibank and Latitude, because these things have hit and they've hurt us really bad. And now we're going, okay, well, maybe we better do things differently.
Do you think that, like, I've just done a course on OWASP for developers, and it's like a very short course, goes for an hour in totality around all of the OWASP kind of top 10. Do you think that stuff is relevant still, even though it came out in 2021? Like, how important is it for developers to align to those things as the first consideration when developing?
I think the top 10 is a really, really good starting point. It's probably what got me extra interested. I literally had one day an epiphany in the shower. This must have been like 2009 or 10. I was like, I should just write the OWASP top 10 for ASP.NET developers. And I'll just go through the top 10 and I'll take all of the objectives there, all the risks, and I'll put them into the context of here's what you do in ASP.NET.
Love it.
And we certainly use that at Pfizer as sort of the baseline. Any organizations or anything that you need to understand all this, we're going to assess you against that. So I think it's a good sort of independent hierarchical reference. I don't know if I've even seen what's in the latest one, but certainly there are many times there where things would oscillate between some odd groups, but that's not really the point. The point is that you've got a talking piece that people can start looking at and going, well, these are the big picture, most important things. And then after that top 10, there's a gazillion other things as well. But these are the big ticket items at the moment.
Access management, configuration, security misconfiguration, and things of that nature, which, to your point about the Optus hack, it was simply, my understanding, is a misconfiguration of the endpoint. So there's kind of could have been mitigated quite a lot with shifting all of that kind of thinking left in the industry, which seems to be happening a lot more broadly across the space.
And look, I mean, in the Optus situation, it sounds like there was an API that was once used and was authed and then became unauthed and then was no longer used, but someone found it. And I wonder if part of the problem too is it's obviously such a big organization with so many moving parts. Do we just possibly need to accept that a little bit like the road toll, there will always be some degree of attrition? We'll never get it down to zero. But whilst we want to either travel around in 2-ton machines doing 100K an hour, or have all of these digital moving parts online, recognize that there's got to be an equilibrium somewhere where we make these things work and provide their intended function, but we accept there's going to be some attrition as well.
What is the most, looking at data breaches you've seen in the past or even investigated yourself, what's the most unusual sort of tactic or technique you've sort of seen that surprised you? I mean, we see things like these API breaches, but have there been any really weird ones where you've just sort of taken a step back and gone, I don't see that every day?
I thought you were going to say what was the weirdest data breach, and then I was going to say we're not going to talk about that here.
I'd like to hear that one too, if it's safe for work.
If we catch up, no, it's definitely not. If we catch up and have a beer somewhere, I wanted to one day
the after dark version.
Exactly, like the after dark conference. I can never do it at a real conference because I'll never be allowed to come back again. But it's just some of the funniest things. Anyway, where were we? Most interesting techniques. I felt I saw something the other day, and I can't remember what it is. To be honest, for the most part, it's the same stuff just repeated over and over and over again. And sometimes it goes through phases. So there's a period there where it was like a lot of exposed MongoDB with no passwords. Well, there were a lot of Elasticsearch for a while. Then we see these phases where they might be centered around a particular vulnerability or third party. All of the Snowflake stuff earlier this year. That was a great example. So I think, and maybe that's sort of a good example where obviously someone managed to find a foothold in a vulnerable account from a service provider or something to that effect. And that was the thing that opened the Pandora's box of all the other stuff.
Mm.
But it's just a good question.
I guess it's like kind of like a trend in waves, like almost anything that goes viral. Someone finds this one vulnerability, they share it with their network, and then everyone sort of jumps on it, and it kind of just rides that wave out until the next one.
Yeah, and then of course it depends what it is, because someone might want to keep that pretty quiet because it's of value to them. I think a lot of people in this industry aren't real good at keeping stuff quiet either.
The trade secrets of the attacker.
Well, that might also be sort of something that speaks to motivations. I would suggest that a huge number of the data breaches that are in Have I Been Pwned come from people that don't have that aren't necessarily malicious and don't necessarily have a financial motive, but just like seeing how far they can go. And we see time and time again, just particularly on some of these popular hacking forums, dumps and dumps of data. Hey, I've just breached such and such. Here's the data. It's like what?
It's a game, isn't it? It's a game between these guys.
Totally. And I think if you look at it through the lens of so frequently these are either legally children who are involved in this or very young adults, so they don't yet have the sort of the moral and social compass to realize the impact of what they're doing. So I think looked at it that way, you can sort of understand why maybe they're not necessarily like hardened criminals who are out there just looking to make money, but they are playing the game and are just not aware of the real world consequences.
The cybercrime ecosystem is just fascinating to me because, between state-sponsored material and buying hacks or access, and then you've got hacktivists, and then you've got ransomware gangs. It's kind of like everyone's got different number of fingers in the pie, but it's all that kind of really unfortunate pie for us all.
What I find really interesting now is I've been doing a lot with law enforcement and government, and on any given day I go between maybe sitting there in person with some of these agencies and then talking to organizations that have been breached and then talking to the people that are in some cases the first parties responsible for the incident. And I just had like this mental model of looking around the room going, gee, this is an interesting set of people, isn't it? Like how do we have all of these discussions and then maintain the trust between them as well? Because as much as I don't want to see cybercrime and data breaches, when it does happen, I need the trust of the people who are involved in that to provide the data so that we can notify the victims. And of course, we want the relationships with law enforcement because they're doing a really important job, but we don't ever want to do the wrong thing. That then they're looking at you going, maybe don't encourage those data breaches or things like that. So it's a very interesting kind of set of dynamics that's going on here.
What's the most unexpected or unusual reaction you've ever received after informing an organization or a person that their data's been breached or compromised? I
think probably the one that frustrates me the most and really should be the most unusual is reaching out to organizations and getting replies from lawyers. Nothing of any severity bad has ever happened to us, touch wood. So I'll lead with that. But there's certainly been many occasions where lawyers end up involved. And I mean, to give you an example, there was one a little while ago where I forget which part of the world they were in. That there wasn't our usual sort of Five Eyes League of Nations kind of thing. But I found the CTO of the company who'd been breached on LinkedIn, and I contacted him and I went, look, here's who I am. Here's links to my Wikipedia and so on. I'm not some rando. There's been a data breach. Can you please get in touch? I want to send you over the data so you can verify it before I let my subscribers know. And then I just get an email from their lawyer and they're like, why do you have this data? Where did you get it from? Who did you pay for it? This might be something that we need to talk to the FBI about. And I have to go and explain it all. And it's like, the FBI knows who we are. Here's the article about them providing us data for this. I didn't say it in a snarky way, but I was thinking it in a snarky way. And eventually this person turned out to be quite reasonable, that the lawyer, but they're in a world that's unfamiliar to them. And in their mind, they're going, stolen data. This guy from Australia with the weird service name has got the data. What do we do?
Particularly pwned is like a hackery term. They might think, oh, there's some random hacker forum. Like I can kind of see how people go down that rabbit hole of thinking, particularly not being cyber.
Yeah, the alarm bells are going off and they're not reading it properly. And they're just going, oh my gosh, I'm jumping straight to conclusions.
The thing that makes it particularly messy as well is it's for so many reasons as it relates to like lawyers and companies. But obviously data breaches are criminal acts. And in most cases, that there needs to end up being some engagement of legal counsel for everything from how does the organisation respond to the breach, and part of that is they've got to figure out how they're going to respond because everyone's getting class action to these days. So as soon as you have a data breach, anything you say and do is then going to be used as part of the class action, so that 1 million people come after you because they all want their $3 that they're going to get from a class action because that's all you ever get. Lawyers, meanwhile, seem to do very well out of that. So anyway, there's organisations lawyering up because they're worried about that. Very often the individuals taking the data, I feel increasingly so, are trying to shake the company down for money. So there was one I can't name that, but was recent where lawyers were involved very, very quickly. And I'm confident part of it was because I know the person who took the data was trying to do a deal to get them to pay for the data. Now, I can see where you need lawyers then as well. But then when I'm sitting there and then someone's giving me the data, that's an awkward kind of position.
It was something that I was going to ask you, but I wasn't sure if you'd be open to discussing it. But that kind of gray area around, you are effectively dealing with, I guess, very sensitive material. You're obviously a trusted individual. There's no nefarious intent. You've built a reputation off that. I'm a trustworthy individual that has had no nefarious intent. How hard was it to establish that reputation at the start, particularly with things like the FBI? And they're like, we'll take you to the FBI. Was that very challenging, or did you find they were quite open to having someone on their side?
Yeah, well, I guess first thing I'd say is it's changed a lot over time for many reasons. I think one is that over the course of time, I've been able to, build a track record and trust, which helps. I think the perception of data breaches and the reaction is changing over time as well. And I feel it's I guess, much more recognised as something that is a very common problem these days and is less kind of out there in the dark ends of the internet. So that certainly happened as well. But for me, like each step along the way, and it's almost an hourly thought. It's like, okay, where's the moral compass on this? Which way are we going to go? And there's all of these little decision points all the way through the history of Have I Been Pwned, which have led us to where we are now. So it'll be things like there are only email addresses in the service. The number of times people say, look, could I get back the password or could I get back the other records? And I can see the value to them. But I never want to do that because of the risk that I'd love to do that. Don't get me wrong. I'd love to do it and be confident that the person requesting it is the owner of it.
Person getting it, yeah.
But very, very difficult to do that. So, we haven't done that. When Ashley Madison happened, flagging data breaches that were particularly sensitive as sensitive breaches, so they can't be publicly searched. But by the same token, it was a conscious decision to make data breaches publicly searchable without having to verify control of the email address for all sorts of good reasons. And I think every one of these steps along the way has helped. Every time there's been an organisation that I've communicated with, I've always offered to talk. Often I'll just send them my phone number and say, give me a call if you want, particularly if they're in Australia. I have a lot of video conferences just like this with organisations where the people on the other end are figuring out what the hell they're going to do with this massive data breach. So I think being approachable and being able to talk to people and not be too much of a weird rando internet hacker dude helps. It probably helps now that I'm well into my 40s as well. Maybe if I was like in my 20s and doing this and I wouldn't seem as trustworthy now that I'm old.
Do you have like a council of people you kind of talk about the ethics of this stuff around, or is it mostly just kind of internal in a turmoil kind of?
Increasingly, there is a council of people, not in a formal way beyond Charlotte and I, and we certainly talk about this here again on a daily basis, which is why she never gets a break. That sounded obnoxious. She's not saying that, but it's why we never turn off. But particularly as we're spending more time with law enforcement agencies and governments in particular, I'm making a real effort to go and spend time face-to-face with them, which we've done many times this year just in Australia. We did the same with the Dutch, and I feel another couple of places last year. And we're about to go back to the US and Canada and see a bunch of folks over there as well. And it will be everything from sitting in meeting rooms, having discussions, through to I go and try and drink beer with all of them. Firstly, because I like drinking beer. Secondly, because it is a nice social thing and people get to build a bit of rapport. But it's just really interesting to hear what the priorities are. And even in Australia at the moment, obviously we've just had a change of cybersecurity minister, but looking at the effort that's gone into positioning Australia and the expectations of how Australian organisations should behave, that's a discussion that we're increasingly more involved in as well. And I just think all of that helps us understand what the, I guess, the sentiment and the appetites are of those who are very important in this space.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
How do you balance the public's right to know about data breaches with the potential for causing a bit of, panic or concern? Because we've seen that in the last couple of years with all the big ones. Obviously, everyone needs to know what's happening, in what steps they need to take to keep themselves secure. But a lot of people I speak to it is panic station.
So that's a really good question, and I think where I see the balance that's really tricky at the moment is not. It's almost like the right or the obligations for individuals to know, balancing that with the risk that we take on ourselves by letting people know. To add one little bit to the last answer first, one of the things we've been doing over recent years is spending a lot more money on our own lawyers to try and make sure that we're doing everything as straight as we possibly can. And that's something which is entirely invisible to everyone else, not because it's meant to be hidden away, but who really wants to hear me sitting there talking about all the meetings we've had with lawyers? It's very much, it's everything from how do we make sure that our processing practices are right, the very, very lengthy terms and conditions, which I'm sure nobody reads on Have I Been Pwned, the amount of backwards and forwards with lawyers to establish all of that. And then all the other stuff that might not be so obvious. We're at a higher risk by running this. So asset protection, trying not to get sued into existence, insurances. Try getting insurance running a business like this.
Yes, I can only imagine.
And we have, but it wasn't fun and it definitely wasn't cheap.
Had to call a couple of FBI buddies.
But I mean, that would be nice, wouldn't it? But I'm also conscious that all the support from law enforcement agencies around the world won't make one iota of difference if there's a company that gets angry enough and throws enough money at it. It's just going to hurt us. And I'm sure if we end up in there in court, we'll be talking about how much support there is from law enforcement, but that won't stop us from getting there in the first place. Yes, the balance about notifying people. The single biggest frustration I have right now is when there's a data breach, someone gives me the data. Usually by the time I get it, lots of other people have it. It's out on public hacking forums, everything else. They give it to me and I'm like, okay, so now I've got this. I know that this data is in the hands of lots of nefarious parties. There's one I'm going to load probably in a few hours from now. I won't say what it is just in case I change my mind. It's one that is out there. I know it's on a hacking forum. I know it's being exchanged with people. I've tried contacting them. I can't get in touch with the organization. I've contacted multiple Have I Been Pwned subscribers and said, hey, did you use this service? Did you make these purchases? Yes. I'm totally high degree of confidence it's legit. Why aren't I telling people? I almost loaded it on Friday and I was just at a show, like I just feel a bit uneasy, but I think I need to go like one more step. Even though there was a bit of it in the press in like a smaller journal, every person I've contacted has said they haven't been told about this. So I don't want to load this and then I might have, say, 10,000 Have I Been Pwned subscribers in there. At least a few of them are going to get super upset, get in touch with the company and go, why didn't you tell me? And then if they get really upset and come to us, that makes our life really hard. So, and they might do that anyway, but I've at least got to be able to go, look, I tried. I tried to get in touch with you. But I have this massive frustration where organizations are not prioritizing letting the individuals know. This company hasn't responded to me. One of the others I was referencing without saying the name of it earlier on definitely knows about the incident and has a very large number of customers that they simply will not tell.
Interesting.
They just won't tell them.
Yeah, really interesting.
They've reported it to their local regulator. The regulator knows, but they're not telling the individuals. And that to me is just, it's unfathomably irresponsible. But this was one particular case where it's like if I push this any further, that could make it very difficult for us to keep running the service. And it
didn't occur to me that would actually happen, that
all the
a big organization
I was about to say, I do. often see like the data breach happened in August, but we're letting you know now. Like, how is that a very common thing that they're sitting on it for a little bit before notifying people? Or
And just to finish on the point when Beck was like so
Sorry.
incredulous about this is a company you guys both really you know really well, and you probably use as well, so, which makes it. We'll tell you over beer one day. We're going to have this beer thing.
Sounds great.
But there is often a lead time, and then you go, well, why is there a lead time? Well, there are occasionally good, valid reasons. So the AT&T situation recently, where it looks like they got caught up in Snowflake as well. Apparently, they did have requests from FBI to not disclose this incident until there'd been more thorough investigation, because it looks like it was like a significant portion of call records from the US. Now, that may have a national security impact. That's a good reason. Very often, an organisation will go, well, there's ongoing law enforcement investigation. That doesn't necessarily mean you can't let people know, and particularly if we're talking about, let's say it's something which is unlikely to have impact of national interest. Maybe it's just a site you've bought T-shirts on, and you've got names, addresses, phone numbers, dates of birth, because it's a website, and they just ask for that. And that's all that's on there. You know, it's not a threat to critical infrastructure. And the organisation will just sit on it, and in many cases not notify the individuals at all. And the regulatory structures we have both in Australia and in other parts of the world, including GDPR and CCPA and all the other acronyms, are usually predicated around notifying the regulator within a certain period of time, but notifications only go to individuals if there's say under our notifiable data breach, a likelihood of serious harm. Mm-hmm. Now, if your T-shirt purchases get taken, is there a likelihood of serious harm? You know, remember, it's self-assessed. So I imagine the organisation going, no, it's just T-shirts. Meanwhile, everyone who's bought the T-shirts has used the same passwords as they use for their bank and their social media and all the other important stuff, but you get to self-assess. And the thing that I just cannot get over is the blatant unwillingness in so many cases to let individuals know. And I think this is where...
Leave them open to credential stuffing and, you know, that kind of stuff, just cascades.
It is. I think the only saving grace there is that we're seeing more resilient hashing algorithms more frequently. We see less plain text in SHA-1 and more bcrypt these days, which is a good start. But yeah, anyway, this sort of the point is it's still your personal information and someone's taken it. And I just can't fathom how organisations would not feel accountable to that. But we have a regulatory regime that supports it as well. I mean, our notifiable data breach scheme, you've got to be a $3 million a year revenue company before you fall under a lot of the privacy laws. And now that's a single-digit percentage of Australian companies. So everyone else gets not necessarily a free pass, because it still hurts them to have a data breach, but they skip that reporting obligation. And I just feel that it's massively unfairly skewed towards not burdening the organisation whilst the individuals who are the real victims go unprotected. I mean, look, we did see our outgoing cybersecurity minister now talk very publicly around the everyday Aussies like you and I are the real victims, and they're the ones that should be put first. Yep. But until we have enough teeth to penalise organisations that don't do that, I don't think it'll change.
Yeah, it kind of takes away the personal agency of that knowledge. You know, you want that knowledge to keep yourself safe, and I think it's pretty important.
Yeah, true.
Have you found the attitudes generally globally differ in that notifiable aspect of notifying customers? Like, are Australia more transparent, less transparent? Is it very just industry based? Is it hard to say across the board how people act? Or
look, there are definitely some cultural differences. Someone like China is very different. There's a very, very different view of privacy there. But I think in general, particularly as Europe got GDPR, we would hear so much about the sort of the rights and freedoms of data subjects in the EU. And even within the EU, it's very different. Germany in particular is extraordinarily privacy-centric. And there's been an expectation there of more privacy. We've all seen cookie warnings before. Try spending time in Europe. All these websites we go to here in Australia don't let me think about. So, why do we get a cookie warning now? Oh, yeah, because privacy. So there's definitely a different philosophical view there, but I feel that in practice, I don't know that it is actually that different. And we're certainly seeing many data breaches of EU data subjects, EU companies, where there are not notifications going to individuals, because again, that's not the regulatory obligation. They've got to report to their local regulator, usually within 72 hours, but then all the individuals could go unnotified. And one incident comes to mind. There's a French streaming company called Deezer, and Deezer had a breach. They had about 230 million people, I think, a few years ago.
Well. Yep.
After GDPR, they didn't notify people. But I got the data, and I think we sent hundreds of thousands of emails because we've got nearly 5 million subscribers on Have I Been Pwned. So you take the intersection of those two corpuses, and a lot of people got told by us. And eventually Deezer did disclose well after that. But that then puts a lot of pressure back on the company because everyone's like, hey, you got breached, you knew about it, you didn't tell us.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fascinating conundrum that organizations have in front of them. I think the view to move more of the responsibility to what you collect, how you collect it, and how long you keep it would be seemingly a big solve to a lot of these things. Sorry, I didn't really have anything to follow up on that.
No, but I think you're going down like the data minimization path, right? Like, can we collect less and can we keep it for less time? I was in the Latitude breach, which was now, it was early last year. And the way I learned I was in the Latitude breach is Mum and Dad came over one day and they had an envelope sent to their address, which I hadn't lived in since the 90s. And they're like, hey, it's from Latitude. I think you've been in the data breach. I can't even remember, like it was probably a car loan or something when I was a teenager. It was something so stupid. Why did you still have this information? There is
I got notified because I got a password reset text, but it was for a completely different credit union, and it's because it had been absorbed by Latitude.
Yeah.
And I just looked at it and went, I used that to pay a dentist bill 20 years ago or something. They still have that. They still have it.
It's miraculous how much of us is floating around out there.
I feel part of the answer to the question of why is that it's much easier and these days much cheaper just to retain data than to delete it. Yes, storage is cheap, right? We've all seen the figures on the cost of a megabyte over the course of time. But writing code to purge things out is an expensive exercise. And that's in the self-interest of the organization rather than the interest of the individuals.
And also it's a hoarder mentality with that data as well. I mean, what if we need it? What if it's useful? What are we going to do with it?
I do think shifting the mindset around what data's value is for organizations is probably pretty critical to the whole thing. I mean, I read a line when the whole Optus saga was going on that really resonated with me, which was people view data as gold. It's actually uranium. The longer you hold on to it, the more toxic it is. And I think that's an analogy that can kind of make a lot of sense when we start talking about these things. So yeah, I agree with that, I guess.
That's a good saying. Look, I like the data minimization principle because it's the simplest security control. If you don't have it, you can't lose it.
If you don't have it, you can't get 100%.
What are you collecting and what are you retaining? Look, I've certainly even looked at Have I Been Pwned and go, we've probably got some stuff we don't need to have anymore. People who tried to sign up for notifications, put the email address in, but then, 3 weeks later, for argument's sake, haven't clicked the verification link. We don't actually need those email addresses anymore. Now, that's really not going to be a consequence to anyone if they did get breached anyway. It's literally just email addresses, but you extend that through to all of the personal documents you submit for things and your dates of birth and other identity verification questions, and suddenly it's substantial.
Yep.
Right. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. Do you have any final thoughts for our listeners about things that they can do right now, other than using Have I Been Pwned?
Or a password manager.
To keep track of, or a password manager to really secure themselves, or at least take that next step.
I think that puts everyone so far ahead. Having a password manager, understanding out of those second factor authentication mechanisms, which ones are appropriate where. I have security keys, but I don't use them everywhere because frankly they're burdensome in some cases, and the risk and the impact is not the same as for something like my Google account. And that only asks for the security key once every time when I set it up on a new PC. So I'm happy to wear that burden and then wear the risk of what happens if I lose the key. And then it's sort of very risk assessment 101. So, all right, how am I going to mitigate the risk of losing a key? Oh, I'll have two keys and I'll put them in different places. And so going through that process, and I think self-assessing and reflecting on your own security. Do you still have places where your account can be reset via the phone number alone? Some people say, SMS 2FA is worse than no 2FA at all because you can use it to reset your account. Well, first of all, that's no longer 2FA. That's 1FA if that's the only thing that can let you do that. But there are services out there that will allow you to do that. So, getting your phone number out of those places. And it's not everything. It's, the place you buy the T-shirt from, you don't care about that much. But email, social, finance, that's the big ticket stuff. Is that locked down?
Your digital footprint is something that I think everyone needs to pay attention to going forward.
Yeah.
And HIBP is a great resource for that. It's one that I've been using for many years as well. So thank you for notifying me of all the data breaches that I've been part of personally.
Good on you.
But yeah, thank you, Troy. Really appreciate your time today. And looking forward to maybe having you on some other time.
Awesome. Thank you both. When we have those beers one day, I'll tell you about those super sensitive breaches.
Sounds amazing.
Absolutely.
All right. Cheers, guys. See ya.
Thanks a lot.